Welcome back everyone to yet another lesson in web development. Today's lesson is all about PHP superglobals. Let's have a look at the objectives in today's lesson. Now for this lesson, we really only have one objective, and that is exploring the different PHP superglobals. Now the reason behind this is because you'll notice that with PHP, unlike JavaScript, all we've been doing is printing out data, calculating data, working with statements, working with arrays, and so on. And that is essentially because PHP is a server-side language, whereas with JavaScript, we actually managed to build really, really beautiful UIs and make those UIs interactive. So in our next session is when we'll actually have our practical demonstration for the content we'll cover here. And then following this, we'll move on to databases, specifically MySQL databases. Once we've wrapped everything up with MySQL databases, we'll revisit PHP and pair the two technologies, because these two technologies are dependent on one another. At some point, we'll have to use PHP to perform some data manipulation. And we'll cover that once we explore MySQL databases in greater detail. So, without further ado, let's dive in. So what exactly are superglobals in PHP? Well, there are several predefined variables in PHP that are called superglobals. This essentially means that they are always accessible regardless of the scope within the script. And you can access them from any function, class, or file without having to do anything special. We've seen how we can actually work with a global variable before, so it's best to think about it along those lines. And here we have a list of the different superglobals that we can actually use in PHP. Now, the list that we have here is not necessarily every single one of them, but these are the most commonly used ones. The first is basically your globals, your get superglobal, post, server, request, files. We also have a superglobal for environment, otherwise known as env. We also have the cookie superglobal. And lastly, we have the session superglobal. Let's dig a little deeper and explore this in greater detail. Now, as we go through the various superglobals, it's important to keep in mind that we don't necessarily have to discuss each and every single one of them. Although I will mention that the ones we are going to discuss are quite important for our practical demonstration. Now, we first have our globals. And essentially, the globals contains a reference to every single variable which is currently available in the global scope of the script. The keys of this array are the names of the global variables. And here we have an example of what the output looks like. You'll notice that we have two globals here, and they are formatted as arrays with key value pairs, namely var1 and var2. So where do we get this? You'll notice outside of the function, we created two variables, var1 and var2, and both of these have been formatted to become globally available throughout the script. You'll also notice that they are used within a function, but the idea behind this is that regardless of being locally scoped within the function as well, we can actually call the globals outside of this function. Next up, we have the get superglobal, and this is used to collect data from a form after submitting an HTML form with the method of get. Now, get can also be used to send data in the URL. Let's have a look at the example. So over here, we've got a simple piece of code where we've created a form, and you'll notice that in this form, we're actually calling the get method. Okay, and the idea behind this is that we are able to get data after processing this form. You'll also notice that in the URL, we can actually see that the username field has been set equal to Jessica. So we can actually pull this data and process it and store this data if we'd like to do so. Now, much like we have a get method, we also have a post method. And this is also widely used to collect data from an HTML form after submitting that form. However, with the post method, the data does not get passed to the URL. And the reason for this is because sometimes you're working with sensitive information and you don't want that information to be displayed in things like a URL. So that's the one big difference between the get and the post method. When working with non-sensitive data, you can actually work with the get method. When working with sensitive data such as passwords and credit card numbers, always opt for post. Now, here's an example of what this looks like. Pretty much the same as the get method. The only difference here is you'll note that the data is not being passed through the URL. Instead of calling the get method on this form, we are calling the post method, and then later on we echo out in a PHP tag simply just the value or the data that the user passed in the username input field. Now, the server superglobal is a very interesting one to work with. And this is an array containing information such as headers, paths, and script locations. The entries in this array are created by the web server. Often this will be your internet service provider. There is no guarantee that every web server will have some of these details. And here is a list of some of the details that you can pull using the superglobal. In essence, we would use the server superglobal if we are requesting any information pertaining to our server, such as the name, the address, and so on. Again, all of this is going to make a lot more sense once we jump into the practical. Now, a cookie is another example of a superglobal, and I'm fairly certain that many of us who interact with websites on a daily basis have always been prompted when loading a website that we have to accept the terms and conditions associated with those cookies. But what are cookies? Cookies are text files stored on the client computer, and they're used for tracking purposes. We generally create a cookie by calling the setCookie function. Now, the server script sends a set of cookies to the browser. For example, this could include data with things such as name, age, identification number, and so on. The browser then stores this information on the local machine for later use. And here we have an example of a cookie. Now, you'll notice that when calling the setCookie function, there are three parameters that this requires. First is the time, or the time out session for this cookie. In this case, it's 1 minute. We also have other details such as the cookie value, and then lastly, the cookie name. And this is what the output looks like before we even load this cookie. And then once the cookie is actually set, this is what the output could possibly look like. In essence, all we've done here is we've just used an if-else statement to check whether or not the cookie has been set, and then we also retrieve the value of that cookie. And then lastly, we have the session superglobal, which is very, very powerful. Now, a session creates a file in a temporary directory on the server where registered session variables and their values are stored. This data will be available to all pages on the website throughout that session where the user is visiting. A session is started with the session_start function. Now, a session also ends when the user closes the browser or after leaving the website. The server will terminate the session after a predetermined period of time, and commonly the time here would be something like 30 minutes in duration. Now, let's take a look at an example. Over here, we have a page which is called our homepage.php, and this is what our output looks like for a session. You'll notice that we call session start over here. And then at the bottom, we actually have two values, which is session and the username, and we also just echo that out. What's important to note here is that your session data can be carried over to a different page, so it does not have to exist on one page specifically. In this example, we are achieving the exact same thing, and we've maintained that session state with that data, and we are doing this in the profile.php script. So we've got two different scripts, one session that's available for X amount of time. And that brings us to the end of this lesson with superglobals. In our next lesson, we are going to apply everything that we've learned here in a practical demonstration. Our next lesson is going to be purely practical before we move on to MySQL databases as promised. So for all of that and more, I'll see you in the next lesson. Cheers.